Hey there, James here with Penner Trailer Sales. Today we're out here. I wanted to do a video on trailer suspension systems, the different types that you'll find, what applications you'll find them in, and some of the pros and cons of each one. Starting out with the lightest duty, we've got here an eye-to-eye suspension. Now, an eye-to-eye suspension gets its name from the spring. The spring has two eyes. And I'll take this apart here to demonstrate that. This is considered the eye of the suspension, the spring, and there's an eye in either end that a bolt goes through. And in the one end, in this case, I'm putting this bolt here through the shackle strap, and this is the rear spring mount. I'll start from the front of the trailer. We'll say that this is the front of the trailer up here. You'll have the front spring mount, have a bolt going through the spring eye. Back here, another bolt through the spring eye with a shackle strap that then is connected to the equalizer. The equalizer is mounted on the center mount, the equalizer mount, and then the same thing here in the back with the rear spring and the rear spring mount. This is a tandem axle suspension, the way I have this laid out here, but you'll also find this as well in a single axle. It'll just have the rear mount, then we'll have this equalizer here, or not an equalizer, sorry, shackle straps. With a spring, because a spring is curved in a bow shape, as it flexes, it gets longer and shorter because you're changing the geometry essentially of the bow. So to accommodate for that length change in the spring, these shackle straps, that's the job of these shackle straps. They essentially allow this spring to get a little longer, a little shorter, depending on the weight and the loading of that spring. Also, this equalizer allows the springs to articulate one from the other, to accommodate different heights, maybe a bump, maybe a dip, what have you. Those springs, or rather those axles, can walk through and the load can remain equalized as the axles go through a dip or over a hump. As you can see with this suspension, one benefit of it is everything is captive. The springs, the equalizer, everything has a direct connection. There's no loose connection. Everything is tight and concise. One of the weaknesses of this suspension, and the reason you'll find it only on lighter duty applications, the weak link is the shackle straps. These over time, if you look, there's not an awful lot of material there. Over time, these holes will wear and stretch, and they'll need to be replaced, ideally before they fail, of course. But this is the weak link. RVs commonly will use these eye-to-eye suspension systems, partly because they're quiet. I have seen some on the market, a real heavy duty shackle strap, about twice as thick as this is. And then also because there's no greasable points in here, all these movement points, there is a plastic bushing in there, but naturally that's going to wear out with time and need to be replaced. But there's none of these points are greasable. So again, in the RV industry, sometimes you'll find what they call a wet bolt kit. You can replace these bolts with a greasable bolt that will grease that joint. Another thing I'll point out is that the spring itself is the mechanical connection between the axle and the trailer frame. That is the thing that attaches the axle to the trailer. And on most, that's the general dynamic. We'll see later on that the hutch suspension does differ in that way. Next, we'll move on to the slipper spring suspension. With the slipper spring suspension, the spring is designed actually a little bit differently in the sense that there's only an eye on one end. So the bolt goes through the front, and then on the back there's just a wear surface, or a slip surface you might say. This is referred to as a slipper spring as opposed to an eye-to-eye spring. So I'll reassemble this here. The operation is very similar. Starting up here on the front, we have a front hanger mount, and it's very similar to the eye-to-eye because the front of the spring is where the eye is and the bolt goes through there. That runs back here to an equalizer. The equalizer looks a little differently, but it functions exactly the same way. This is the center equalizer mount, and you'll notice that this bolt has got a grease cert, so this is a greasable point. Most 7,000 pound suspension systems, 7, 8, and on up, this center bolt here, the equalizer bolt, will be greasable. This will pivot just the same as the previous equalizer we looked at, and then on the rear It's a little hard to show you inside of this equalizer, but you can see it here on the rear spring mount, is that there's just a pipe welded in this rear spring mount, and that slipper spring just rides underneath there on that pipe. You would think that metal on metal that would wear out, and it does over time, but it takes quite a bit of time actually. The first thing to wear out, rather than the spring, because the spring steel would be harder than this pipe, is this pipe. This will wear out. Sometimes, usually then you just replace the rear spring mount. There'll be a bolt through these holes here so that the spring, when it's installed in the rear spring mount, will be captive. So you'll have a little bit of play there, as it were. Not much, and it doesn't make a lot of noise, but that is a little bit of a loose connection there. It's barely really a drawback because it is very robust. With the metal on metal, that can be a noisy point. Maybe turning, it'll kind of sound like it's binding or popping as it moves against itself. Personally, on my trailer that I have that has slipper spring, I actually add some grease here between this contact point, try to keep that grease so it kind of minimizes that a little bit. But again, with this spring, the spring is the attachment point between the axle and the frame. Another thing I'll point out while we're still looking at springs, this band here, this band, an axle pack or a spring leaf stack over time, since there's only a pin here through the center, can begin to move or kind of turn on itself. And so this band here kind of prevents that, helps it keep them lined up. And if you were to break a leaf on the front, it'll keep it from dropping out and potentially catching or going under your tire. So they only put this on one side of the spring, so if you can put that towards the front, although it's no tragedy if it's not. The next one will be the hutch suspension, and this trailer that we're filming with today has that, so we'll look underneath to demonstrate that here next. Here we're looking at what's called a hutch suspension. There's two manufacturers of this type of suspension. There's the hutch suspension, and then Dexter also has their own, they refer to as the HSS, or the heavy duty suspension system. This is found on axle ratings from 10,000 pounds, 12,000 pounds, and 15 or 16,000 pounds. This particular one here is a 15,000 pound axle. I've removed the wheel so we can see the suspension components a little more clearly. This is also a disc brake application as well. So the hutch suspension, it is similar in that it has this equalizer here. This equalizer is rotated all the way since I don't have any weight on this axle from removing the wheels there. The springs are different in the sense that they don't have an eye on the front or the back. They're designed to be able to be a slipper type spring on both the front and the rear. So in contrast to the other suspension systems that we've looked at so far, where the spring is actually attaching the mechanical attachment of the axle to the trailer frame, it's not the spring, it's the control arm here on the front. This is the direct connection from the frame of the trailer to the axle. Now there's one of these on the other side on the front axle here. The other one is, the control arm is threaded. As you can see back here on the rear axle, the control arm is on the opposite side right here by us. That allows you to actually adjust the alignment of the axle to the trailer frame. So if you have a trailer that's tracking a little bit off to the side one way or the other, you can adjust that with that. This is a heavy duty suspension system. It rides well because the spring can slip on both ends, and it's very robust. If you have a heavy duty application, this would be considered, I personally would recommend, this is a desirable suspension system. Finally, the other type of suspension that you'll find fairly commonly actually is the torsion axle. And this is a very different design in that it doesn't have springs. I have a torsion axle laid out here, and there's no other hardware that makes this a torsion axle. There's no spring. This just bolts directly to the frame. You'll find this on anywhere from 3,500 pound axle, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, and 10,000 pound axles. You can get these torsion axles. The way they work is that this square tube here, inside of this square tube is another square rod. And that square rod is turned 45 degrees, so kind of a diamond shape to this outer tube, which leaves a triangle shaped void in the corners. In that void they insert rubber inserts. And so that, as you can see then on the outside, we've got this radius arm here, and then the spindle on the back of the radius arm. When weight is applied, this is bolted directly to the frame. You set the trailer on the ground, and the tire is pushing up and the weight of the trailer is pushing down. This radius arm wants to rotate. And what's resisting the rotation or limiting the rotation is those rubber cushions, those rubber inserts in the corners to prevent that square rod from rotating inside of the axle tube. The suspension travel is basically accomplished inside of this tube. One drawback that we see that in our perspective for a torsion axle is that if you have a tandem axle, you no longer have an equalizer. So if you go through a driveway approach, that you'll see as you go through, the first wheel to go through the dip will actually carry off of the ground, and the rear axle will be carrying everything because there's no articulation between the axles. So then it's easier to point load or have one single axle carrying the entirety of the load rather than both equalizing and sharing it. That can cause situations or dynamics where it's easier to bend an axle as opposed to an equalizer system. It's said that the one pro of the torsion axles is that they ride smoother. I can't necessarily personally attest to that. I'm not sure that I find it to be so, as opposed to one that has an equalizer that's able to walk over the bumps and so on. Some trailer applications require the use of a torsion, but for me personally, I try to avoid a torsion axle actually as much as I can. They're okay. They just have a few more weak points, as it were, as opposed to a sprung suspension that has an equalizer. That generally is an overview of the different suspension systems that you'll find on different trailers, from utility trailers to equipment trailers to dump trailers to gooseneck trailers and so on. I hope that's helpful. Hope that gives some understanding of what's being referred to and the different terms they use: eye-to-eye, slipper spring, hutch suspension, or torsion, and kind of what the pros and cons are and where you'll find them. If you have any questions, we'd be happy if you give us a call here at Penner Trailer Sales, 931-361-1122.